Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and tiptoe into a really fascinating, and sometimes chilling, corner of human history, the world of unmarked graves, and the truly terrible superstitions that have swirled around them for centuries. Forget your perfectly manicured cemeteries with their neat rows of headstones. We're talking about forgotten plots of land, anonymous mounds, or even just patches of unsettled ground where someone, for whatever reason, was laid to rest without a name, without a marker, without a single indication of who they were. Imagine, if you will, walking through a quiet, overgrown field at dusk, the shadows lengthening and feeling an inexplicable chill. A sense that something is just off. It's that primal unease we're going to explore tonight. This isn't just about feeling a bit sad for the anonymous dead. Oh no. Throughout history, unmarked graves have been the breeding ground for some truly unsettling beliefs. We're talking about fears of restless spirits, vengeful ghosts, and even the very ground itself becoming cursed. You probably wouldn't survive a single night trying to sleep near one of these places if you truly believed in the old ways. You'd be jumping at every creak of the branches, every whisper of the wind, convinced that something was stirring beneath the soil, just waiting for its moment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps this little corner of the internet grow, and it lets me know these sleepy historical deep dives are finding their audience. And if you're feeling up to it, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a desolate patch of ground, perhaps on the edge of a forgotten battlefield, or deep within a dense, ancient forest. There's no headstone here, no weathered cross, not even a simple cairn of stones. Just an indistinct rise in the earth, barely discernible from the natural undulations of the landscape. This is an unmarked grave, and immediately, a prickle of unease might crawl up your spine. It's not just the absence of a name that feels unsettling. It's the profound sense of something unfinished, something forgotten, something that perhaps wasn't laid to rest properly. And from this deep, primal unease, countless chilling superstitions have sprung, taking root in the human imagination like dark, gnarled vines for centuries, across diverse cultures and continents. The concept of an unmarked grave has been inherently linked to misfortune, bad omens, and the lingering presence of the uncanny. It wasn't just a matter of disrespect. It was often believed to be an invitation to spiritual trouble, a tear in the fabric of the natural order. Think about it if every other grave has a name, a date, a small epitaph, a deliberate act of remembrance. Then what does the absence of all that imply? It implies anonymity. Yes, but also a lack of proper rites, a forced silence that the dead. So the belief went, were never meant to endure. One of the most pervasive superstitions centers around the idea that the soul of the deceased, without a proper marker or ceremony, remains bound to the earth or to the immediate vicinity of its unhallowed resting place. Unlike those buried with proper rites, whose souls were believed to ascend to an afterlife or a peaceful repose, the spirits from unmarked graves were often thought to be restless. They couldn't move on. They were tethered to their physical remains, trapped in a liminal space between worlds. This wasn't a pleasant thought. A trapped spirit was often believed to be a tormented spirit, and a tormented spirit was a dangerous spirit. You might imagine these restless spirits as pale, wispy figures, forever wandering their small, forgotten plot, perhaps trying to communicate, to reveal their identity, or to exact some form of forgotten justice. Folk tales abound with stories of travelers stumbling upon such graves and immediately feeling a profound sense of sadness. Or worse, a sudden chill, and the distinct feeling of being watched. The very ground might feel colder, or the air might grow heavy, portending the spectral presence. It's a classic trope in horror for a reason: the unknown, coupled with the dead, is deeply unsettling, beyond simple restlessness. Some beliefs held that spirits from unmarked graves were actively malevolent. If a person died a sudden, violent, or unjust death, and was then buried without recognition, their spirit was thought to be particularly vengeful. They might haunt the living, causing illness, bad luck, or even driving people to madness. This fear stemmed from a deep-seated human understanding of justice. If earthly justice was denied to the deceased, then their spirit would seek it from beyond the grave. And an unmarked grave was the ultimate symbol of denied recognition and justice. Consider the historical context. Before formalized graveyards and universal record-keeping, many deaths would have gone unmarked out of necessity. Victims of plague, travelers dying far from home, anonymous paupers, or even individuals whose identities were suppressed like political prisoners or unbaptized infants often found themselves in such forgotten plots. Each of these scenarios carries its own baggage of societal anxiety, and these anxieties were often projected onto the supernatural realm. A plague victim's unmarked grave, for example, might be feared not just for the disease they carried in life, but for the pestilence their unquiet spirit might spread in death. Another layer of superstition involved the very earth above an unmarked grave. It was often believed to be cursed or somehow tainted. Crops planted over such a grave might fail or wither. Water drawn from nearby wells might turn foul, and animals grazing in the vicinity might sicken. This wasn't just a metaphor for bad luck. It was a literal belief in the corruption of the land itself. You wouldn't build a house on an unmarked gravesite, not if you valued your sanity or your family's well-being. The land was considered hot, restless, and liable to bring misfortune to anyone who dared disturb it. One fascinating, if somewhat grim, aspect of these superstitions is how they often converged with specific methods of burial to prevent the very outcomes they feared. For example, in some traditions, particular objects like heavy stones or stakes were driven through the suspected heart of the deceased to pin them down and prevent their restless return. This was especially true for those suspected of being vampires or other forms of revenants, often based on circumstantial evidence like a bloated body or a faint flush of color in the face upon exhumation. While the modern understanding of decomposition explains these phenomena, to people of the past, they were terrifying signs of the unquiet dead. Folklorists and anthropologists still actively debate the precise origins and cross-cultural similarities of these grave superstitions. While many seem to stem from universal human anxieties about death and the unknown, the specific rituals and beliefs vary wildly from one culture to another, suggesting both independent development and cultural diffusion. So, when you encounter an unmarked grave, whether in a dusty old book or a forgotten corner of the internet, remember it's not just a blank space. It's a void filled with centuries of human fear, speculation, and a desperate need to understand what happens when a life ends without proper recognition. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories aren't about monstrous creatures, but about the quiet, persistent unease that comes from a silent, unnamed plot of earth. You've felt the unsettling chill of the unmarked grave. That sense of something left undone. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the ancient beliefs that solidified these fears, the profound conviction that the soul was bound to the earth and to the very physical remains of the deceased. This wasn't just a poetic idea, it was a deeply held, pervasive understanding of death that shaped funerary practices for millennia, making the concept of an unmarked grave particularly terrifying. Imagine a time before modern science, before microscopes and dissections, before a clear understanding of biological processes. Death was a mystery, and the transition from life to whatever came next was fraught with uncertainty. In many ancient cultures, There was a widespread belief that the soul, or the vital essence of a person, remained closely tied to the physical body even after death. It wasn't a clean, immediate departure to some distant heaven or underworld. Instead, the spirit lingered, sometimes for a long time, in the vicinity of the corpse, often needing guidance or ritual to fully detach and move on. This belief meant that the burial site itself became sacred. It wasn't just a plot of land, it was the final threshold. The gate between worlds for that particular individual, to ensure the soul's peaceful journey. Proper rites were essential. These rites varied wildly from culture to culture. Elaborate embalming in ancient Egypt, specific cremation rituals in ancient Greece, or careful inhumation practices across Europe. But the common thread was the idea of doing it right. A proper burial, with the correct prayers, offerings, and respectful handling of the body, was believed to facilitate the soul's transition, guiding it to its intended resting place in the afterlife. Now, picture an unmarked grave in this context. It's a grave without those crucial rituals, without the spoken names, without the offerings, without the physical marker that proclaimed, "Here lies name, who was mourned." To the ancient mind, this was akin to abandoning the soul. If the living didn't provide the necessary send-off, how could the soul find its way? It would be left adrift. A restless spirit, forever tethered to the unhallowed ground, trapped in a perpetual state of confusion or anguish. You can almost feel the weight of this belief. If you were a traveler in a remote area and stumbled upon an anonymous mound, your immediate thought wouldn't just be pity for the unknown dead. It would be a profound sense of danger. That place, without its proper rites, might be a nexus for unquiet spirits. And these spirits, unable to find peace, were often believed to be malevolent towards the living. Why? Because they were suffering. Their continued presence on Earth was a sign of their torment, and that torment could easily spill over onto anyone who ventured too close. Consider the role of name and identity in these beliefs. In many ancient societies, a person's name held immense power. To be named was to exist, to have an identity, to be recognized by both the living and the divine, to die nameless, or to be buried without one's name etched into stone, was to cease to truly exist in the collective memory, and, by extension, to risk oblivion in the afterlife. The unmarked grave was the ultimate erasure, a spiritual death sentence that left the soul marooned. This belief explains why, even for the poorest or most marginalized, some form of marker or acknowledgement was often attempted. A simple stone, a wooden cross, a tree planted over the spot, anything that whispered, "Someone is here." Without even that whisper, the grave was utterly silent, a void, and that silence was profoundly terrifying. It wasn't just practical, it was a spiritual imperative. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that even in prehistoric burial sites, some form of marking or spatial arrangement was common, indicating a very ancient, cross-cultural recognition of the sacredness of burial grounds. This pushes back against the idea that organized cemeteries are a purely modern invention, suggesting a deep-seated human need for marking death. One common fear was that the unquiet dead from unmarked graves might try to possess the living. If a spirit was desperate enough, unable to find peace, it might seek a new vessel, a new way to experience the world, even if it meant taking over a living body. This belief fueled many folk tales of madness, sudden personality changes, or inexplicable illnesses attributed to a wandering spirit from an unmarked grave finding its way into an unsuspecting victim. It's a primal fear, this loss of self, exacerbated by the terrifying idea of a desperate entity seeking refuge within you. Another related superstition involved the idea of ghost sickness, or grave sickness. Simply walking over an unmarked grave, or disturbing the ground above it, was sometimes believed to cause illness, bad luck, or even death. This wasn't necessarily a direct attack by a spirit, but rather an emanation of the grave's unhallowed energy. The ground itself was considered toxic, imbued with the misery of the unquiet dead. You wouldn't just casually stroll across a field suspected of holding such a burial. You'd walk a wide berth around it, perhaps even performing small protective rituals as you passed. The practices surrounding reburial or exhumation also shed light on these fears. If an unmarked grave was accidentally discovered, it often caused great anxiety. The common response was not just to rebury the remains, but to do so with proper ceremony, to give the forgotten soul the rights it had been denied. This act was seen as an appeasement, a way to finally lay the restless spirit to rest and cleanse the tainted ground. It was an acknowledgement that even the long dead, if unhonored, could exert an influence on the living. Think about the psychological impact of these beliefs. If you lived in a world where every unacknowledged death meant a potential restless spirit, you would be incredibly careful about how the dead were handled. It fostered a deep respect for funerary rites and a profound aversion to anything that disrupted the sacred passage of the soul. An unmarked grave was a constant, silent warning of what happened when those vital connections between life, death, and remembrance were severed. This fear also extended to the practice of grave robbing, while often driven by the desire for valuables. Ancient prohibitions against disturbing graves, even marked ones, were rooted not just in respect for the dead, but in the terrifying belief that disturbing a burial would unleash the spirit of the deceased for an unmarked grave. This fear would be exponentially higher. You wouldn't just be disturbing a grave. You'd be disturbing a grave that was already believed to be a source of potential spiritual trouble. So, as you step away from the imagined anonymous mound, consider the ancient fears that cling to it. It's not just a patch of dirt, it's a silent sentinel. A place where the living believed the unquiet dead were bound, yearning for recognition. Or perhaps, simply waiting. The terror wasn't just in what might emerge, but in the profound thought that a soul, unacknowledged, could never truly find peace. You've explored the deep-seated belief that the soul was bound to the earth, a terrifying concept for any unmarked grave. Now, let's focus directly on the fear that truly fueled these superstitions, the idea that such forgotten plots were believed to house restless spirits' curse. This wasn't just vague unease, it was a specific, tangible dread that these unquiet dead would actively cause harm to the living. Imagine, if you will, the psyche of someone in a pre-industrial society, where death was a constant, intimate presence, often sudden and brutal. They believed in a delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Proper burial rites, commemorations, and marked graves were seen as essential acts of respect, designed to facilitate a peaceful transition for the deceased and to maintain harmony for the living. An unmarked grave, then, was a profound disruption to this balance. A glaring omission that left the gate between worlds ajar. The curse of restless spirits was multifaceted. Foremost was the belief in haunting. If a spirit could not find peace, if it was denied recognition or justice in death, it was thought to linger, tethered to its unmarked grave, and potentially extend its influence over the surrounding area. You might imagine faint whispers carried on the wind, the rustle of leaves when no breeze stirred, or the feeling of an icy breath on your neck, even on a warm day. These were not just figments of imagination. They were concrete signs that an unquiet presence was near. A spectral lamentation for what was lost. These hauntings were rarely benign. The restless spirit, tormented by its unacknowledged state, was often believed to project its misery onto the living. This could manifest as bad luck crops failing, livestock falling ill, sudden financial ruin, or inexplicable accidents. It was as if the very misfortune of the dead person, amplified by their suffering, bled into the lives of those who inadvertently trespassed upon their forgotten resting place. You wouldn't want to live near a suspected unmarked grave. not if you valued your prosperity or peace of mind. Even more terrifying was the belief in physical affliction or sickness. It was thought that interacting with the grave, or even just being in its proximity for too long, could drain the life force from a person, or infect them with a mysterious malady. This wasn't just a metaphor for mental distress. People genuinely attributed unexplained fevers, wasting diseases, or chronic ailments to the malevolent influence of an unquiet dead, a child falling ill, a family member wasting away. These might be tragically, superstitiously, blamed on a forgotten grave nearby. It's the ultimate invisible enemy, attacking from beyond the veil. Consider the desperate circumstances that often led to unmarked graves. Victims of plague or epidemics hastily buried to prevent further contamination. Travelers who died far from home and family, without anyone to claim their remains. Criminals executed and denied a dignified burial. Or suicides, often viewed as having transgressed societal or religious norms, and therefore unworthy of marked graves. Each of these categories carried its own set of fears and stigmas, which then attached themselves to the unmarked nature of their burials. For instance, the grave of a plague victim, though unmarked for public health reasons, became doubly feared. Not only did it carry the historical memory of disease, but the unquiet spirit of the unmourned dead was believed to actively spread contagion. Similarly, the spirits of executed criminals were often thought to be filled with wrath. Seeking retribution from the living, the psychological impact of such beliefs cannot be overstated. They shaped behavior, dictated routes of travel, and influenced where people dared to settle. Folklorists generally agree that the fear of the restless dead from unmarked graves served as a powerful social control mechanism, reinforcing the importance of proper funerary rites and community acknowledgement of death. While supernatural, these beliefs had very real practical consequences for behavior. Another specific form of curse was the fear of being drawn into the grave or experiencing unnatural dreams and visions. People might report nightmares of the deceased calling to them, or feeling an irresistible pull towards the unmarked spot. This wasn't just psychological, it was believed to be the spirit's attempt to ensnare the living, to pull them into their liminal state, or even to replace them in the land of the living. It's a chilling thought that the dead might envy the living and seek to reclaim their vitality. This fear also influenced how people treated the land around unmarked graves. The ground was considered unhallowed or polluted. Farmers might refuse to cultivate fields where such graves were suspected, fearing that the soil would be infertile or that the produce would be tainted. Buildings were rarely erected on such spots, and if one was, it was believed to be destined for misfortune, its inhabitants plagued by bad luck or spectral disturbances. It's a primal form of aversion, avoiding what is perceived as spiritually toxic. You might even hear tales of spontaneous, inexplicable phenomena near unmarked graves, strange lights, disembodied voices, or objects moving on their own. These were not seen as random occurrences, but direct manifestations of the restless spirit's anguish or malice. Each unexplained event served to reinforce the terrifying belief that the dead, if unacknowledged, could still exert a very real, very negative influence on the physical world. The deep-seated nature of these fears meant that even if a marked grave was disturbed, it was seen as a grave transgression. But an unmarked grave that was disturbing something already unsettled, already potentially volatile, it was like kicking a hornet's nest that had been buzzing quietly for centuries. The consequences were unpredictable and, by popular belief, almost certainly dire. So, as you step away from the imagined anonymous mound, imagine the weight of centuries of such fears clinging to it. It's not just an unadorned patch of earth, it's a site imbued with the silent screams of restless spirits, the chill of unseen presences, and the potential for a curse that stretches beyond the grave. Touching the living with misfortune, sickness, and unease, it's a powerful reminder of how intensely our ancestors grappled with the mysteries of death. and the profound importance of laying the departed to a peaceful rest. You've explored the chilling beliefs that restless spirits from unmarked graves could actively curse the living. Now, let's turn our attention to the desperate, sometimes bizarre, measures people took to counter these perceived threats. We're going to delve into the historical methods used to ward off the undead and prevent the rise of the unquiet dead from their unhallowed resting places. These weren't just passive fears, they led to active, physical interventions rooted in a mixture of folklore, desperate superstition, and a sprinkle of morbid ingenuity. Imagine living in a world where the line between life and death felt far thinner, where the dead weren't just gone, but potentially lingering, capable of mischief or malice. If an unmarked grave was believed to house a restless spirit, or a potential revenant, someone who returns from the dead, often with ill intent, like a vampire or ghoul, people didn't just passively hope for the best, they acted. And these actions often involved physically trying to keep the deceased from emerging. One of the most widely recognized, and perhaps gruesome, methods involved staking. If a body was suspected of being a potential revenant, perhaps it died mysteriously, or its grave was found disturbed, or it had certain physical characteristics upon exhumation, like a bloated appearance or a lack of decomposition that was misunderstood. Villagers might drive a wooden stake, usually hawthorn or oak, through the corpse's heart or abdomen. The idea was to physically pin the body to the earth, preventing it from rising and causing trouble. This wasn't necessarily done for every unmarked grave, but if an anonymous burial was deemed particularly suspicious, this was a terrifying last resort. Beyond staking, other physical deterrents were used. Sometimes, the body would be decapitated, and the head placed between the legs or away from the body, to disorient the deceased and prevent it from finding its head and reanimating. Imagine the macabre scene: digging up a body, severing the head, all in a desperate attempt to ensure a peaceful sleep for the dead and safety for the living. This was a gruesome undertaking, but one driven by intense fear and a belief in its efficacy. Another common practice involved filling the mouth of the deceased with substances believed to ward off evil or prevent the consumption of flesh. Garlic was a popular choice, particularly in Eastern European folklore associated with vampires. Stones, bricks, or even coins might also be placed in the mouth or under the tongue. The idea was to prevent the revenant from feeding or from whispering curses. This was a subtle yet deeply symbolic act of prevention. You might also find evidence of bodies being buried face down or in an otherwise uncomfortable position. The reasoning here was grimly logical. If the deceased tried to dig their way out, they would only dig themselves deeper into the earth. Unable to find their way to the surface, it's a testament to the vivid imagination of how the dead might try to return, and the determination of the living to thwart them. The very act of burying someone at a crossroads, a common fate for suicides, unbaptized infants, and criminals, which we'll explore more later, was itself a method of warding. Crossroads were considered liminal spaces, confusing and disorienting to spirits. The idea was that the restless ghost, if it tried to leave its grave, would become lost at the intersection, unable to find its way into settled communities. It was a spiritual maze designed to trap the unquiet dead. You wouldn't just bury someone there because it was convenient. You'd bury them there because it was a place of spiritual confusion. A barrier. Archaeological evidence has revealed numerous historical burials that exhibit these anti-vampire or anti-revenant measures, prompting academic debate over whether these practices were universal or localized responses to specific folk beliefs. The variations suggest a rich tapestry of regional superstitions and preventative rituals. One lesser known, but fascinating, method involved scattering seeds or grains, like poppy seeds or millet, over the grave. The superstition held that if a revenant tried to rise, it would be compelled by a supernatural compulsion to count every single grain before it could leave the grave. This would trap the spirit in an endless, futile task, preventing it from reaching the living. It's a beautifully simple, yet psychologically insidious, form of supernatural deterrence, exploiting a supposed compulsion of the undead. Sometimes, heavy stones or boulders were placed directly on top of the grave, not just as a marker, but as a physical weight to keep the body pinned down. Think of it as a literal burden, designed to anchor the deceased firmly in the earth. Similarly, the burial of the deceased within strong, unyielding materials, like stone coffins or tightly packed earth, was also believed to contribute to a more secure and less permeable grave. The fear wasn't always of a fully reanimated corpse. Often, it was the more subtle, insidious influence of the unquiet dead. To counteract this, protective amulets or charms might be buried with the deceased, or even placed around the grave by worried relatives or local villagers. These could be anything from religious symbols to specific herbs or objects believed to possess protective properties. It was an attempt to imbue the grave with a spiritual barrier. Protecting both the deceased's peace and the living's safety, you might even find historical records of elaborate exorcisms or specific blessings being performed over suspected unmarked graves to pacify a restless spirit. If all else failed, and the signs of a haunting persisted, the church or local religious figures might be called upon to intervene, attempting to drive the unquiet spirit away or to finally guide it to its proper rest. This highlights the blend of folk superstition and formal religious practice in dealing with the fear of the undead. These methods, while chilling to our modern sensibilities, were born from a desperate need to control the uncontrollable, to make sense of death, and to protect communities from perceived supernatural threats. They are a tangible reminder of a time when the dead were not just remembered, but feared. And when the boundaries between this world and the next were terrifyingly permeable. Each stake, each scattered seed, each severed head tells a silent story of human fear, and the lengths people would go to find a sense of security in an uncertain world. You've explored the grim methods used to literally pin down the dead. Now, let's consider a very specific and highly symbolic category of unmarked grave that truly embodies society's fears and judgments. The practice of burying certain individuals at the perilous crossroads. This wasn't just a convenient spot, it was a deliberate choice. Steeped in superstition and designed to isolate and disorient the most feared of the unquiet dead, imagine a lonely, windswept crossroads where two ancient paths intersect, far from any village or consecrated ground. The air here feels different, perhaps charged with an unspoken tension. This was often the chosen resting place for individuals deemed unworthy of Christian burial, or those whose deaths were considered abnormal or unsettling. We're talking about suicides, criminals, and sometimes even unbaptized infants. Each category carried a heavy burden of social stigma and fear, and this stigma followed them even into the grave, for centuries, across Europe and beyond. Suicides were denied burial in consecrated churchyards. The act of taking one's own life was seen as a grave sin, a rejection of God's gift of life, and a crime against the community. To bury a suicide in holy ground was thought to contaminate it, bringing ill fortune to the entire parish. So, where did they go? Often to the crossroads. The belief was that the spirit of a suicide, being restless and tormented, would be confused by the intersecting paths. Unable to find its way back into the community it had betrayed. It was a spiritual maze, a perpetual disorientation designed to trap the unquiet soul. You can almost feel the chill of isolation associated with such a burial. No prayers, no eulogies, no comforting rituals. Just a swift, often clandestine burial. Typically at night, at a desolate intersection. Sometimes, a stake would be driven through the body as well, a double precaution to ensure the suicide stayed put. This wasn't just about punishment and death. It was about protecting the living from a spirit believed to be actively malicious or despairing enough to draw others to a similar fate. Similarly, executed criminals were often interred at crossroads. These were individuals who had committed grave offenses against society, and their bodies were often treated with contempt even after death. Denying them a proper burial was part of their final punishment, a symbolic excommunication from the community even in the afterlife. Their spirits, too, were believed to be restless and potentially vengeful, perhaps seeking to continue their wicked ways from beyond the grave. Burying them at the crossroads was a way to disarm them, to scatter their malevolent influence at a place of confusion. Consider the grim procession, the body of the condemned, perhaps still hanging from the gallows or freshly cut down, being hauled to the remote crossroads. There, a shallow grave would be quickly dug, and the body unceremoniously dumped, perhaps with a stake driven through it. No marker, no prayers, just the silent earth swallowing another outcast. It's a powerful image of societal rejection, even in death. Then there's the sad, often heartbreaking, case of unbaptized infants in earlier times, particularly within Christian societies. Unbaptized babies who died were often denied burial in consecrated ground, as they were believed to be in a state of limbo or original sin, unable to enter heaven. While this was not seen as a punishment for the infant, it was a practical matter of keeping unconsecrated souls out of holy ground. Their innocence, however, often led to less malevolent superstitions around their graves. They were sometimes believed to become fairy babies, or simply sad, wandering spirits, rather than actively malicious ones. Still, their burial at crossroads, often unmarked, speaks to their marginalized status in death. Archaeological findings of human remains at historical crossroads often confirm these burial practices, though direct evidence linking specific individuals to the precise reasons for their burial can be challenging to ascertain definitively. Forensic analysis, however, sometimes reveals signs of violent death or methods consistent with anti-revenant rituals, lending credence to the historical accounts. The choice of a crossroads was highly significant. Liminal spaces, thresholds, boundaries, places where things intersect, have always held a powerful, often unsettling, symbolic meaning in folklore. They were seen as places where the veil between worlds was thin, where spirits could easily cross over, but also where they could become trapped. The intersecting paths were believed to confuse the wandering spirit, preventing it from following a straight line back to the village or finding a pathway to the afterlife. It was a spiritual cul-de-sac. You might hear a folktale of someone walking past a crossroads at night and hearing faint whispers, or seeing a shadowy figure flitting between the converging paths. These were the believed manifestations of the restless dead, forever caught in the confusing geometry of their final resting place. The very air around such places was often considered tainted, unlucky, or even dangerous, especially after dark. No one lingered at a crossroads grave after sunset. This practice also served a very practical, if cruel, purpose. By burying these marginalized individuals far from consecrated grounds and community centers, it physically separated their remains and their perceived spiritual contamination from the living. It was a form of physical and spiritual quarantine, ensuring that the unclean dead could not infect the clean living. One slightly unsettling detail is that the fear surrounding these graves could sometimes lead to a form of morbid tourism. People might visit these sites, not out of respect, but out of a morbid curiosity, to witness the tangible signs of transgression and the supposed lingering presence of the unquiet dead. This kind of interaction only served to reinforce the superstitions, turning the crossroads into a perpetual cautionary tale. So, as you step away from the imagined crossroads, where the paths of the living and the dead converge in uneasy silence, Remember the tragic stories and the profound fears that shaped these perilous resting places. It's a stark reminder of society's judgments, the desperate measures taken to protect the living, and the eternal longing for a peaceful, marked rest. Even for those who seemingly left the world without one. You've explored the grim reasons for crossroads burials and the societal fears attached to them. Now, let's delve deeper into how these anxieties about unmarked graves weren't just abstract beliefs, but actively shaped popular culture and everyday life. We're going to examine how these folkloric fears manifested in local legends, cautionary tales, and even practical behaviors across various communities, weaving themselves into the very fabric of daily existence. Imagine growing up in a village where, just beyond the fields, there was that place, a patch of ground, known to hold an unmarked grave. You didn't need a headstone to know it. The stories, whispered around the hearth on long winter nights, were marker enough. These were the cautionary tales that instilled a healthy, or perhaps unhealthy, respect for the unquiet dead. You'd hear about Old Man Henderson's prize cow falling mysteriously ill after he dared to graze it too close to the witch's grave, likely just an anonymous, perhaps eccentric, individual, or the young lovers who, ignoring warnings, held a secret rendezvous near Suicide's Hill and were plagued by nightmares and misfortune ever after. These aren't just spooky stories for entertainment. They were often functional narratives designed to reinforce social norms and explain inexplicable events. If crops failed, or a localized illness spread, or a family suffered a series of misfortunes, the unmarked grave nearby often became the convenient, supernatural scapegoat. It provided an explanation, a narrative framework for understanding bad luck in a world without scientific explanations for everything. It also subtly warned against deviating from accepted burial practices and respecting the dead. You can almost feel the weight of these local legends. They weren't written down in formal histories, they were passed from generation to generation by word of mouth, evolving slightly with each retelling but retaining their core message: beware the unacknowledged dead. These tales often included very specific details. The type of tree growing over the grave, a gnarled, twisted oak. Perhaps the strange way the mist gathered there on certain nights, or the particular animal cries heard after dark. Such details gave the legends a palpable sense of reality and immediacy for those who lived alongside them. Think about the impact on daily routines. A farmer might deliberately plow around a certain patch of earth, even if it meant sacrificing a small portion of his field, because it was known to contain an unmarked burial. Children would be explicitly warned not to play in certain areas. Travelers might take longer routes to avoid passing by a notorious unmarked gravesite after sunset. These fears weren't abstract. They dictated movement, shaped land use, and even influenced where homes and communities were established. No one wanted to build their house on ground that was cursed by the lingering presence of an unquiet spirit. The appearance of certain plants or fungi near unmarked graves also became part of the folklore. Sometimes particularly vibrant. Unnaturally green grass or a cluster of unusual mushrooms might be interpreted as a sign of the earth being fed by the remains below, indicating an active, powerful presence. Conversely, barren spots where nothing would grow could be seen as areas where the land itself was too tainted or consumed by the restless energy of the dead. It's a subtle way the landscape itself was read for supernatural meaning. Anthropological studies show that such negative sacred sites, born from fear and taboos, are common across many traditional cultures, serving as boundaries for acceptable behavior and places to avoid. This isn't just a quirky historical detail. It's a fundamental aspect of how communities define safety and danger, both real and perceived. Consider how these fears bled into the understanding of poverty and misfortune. If a family consistently faced hardship, they might begin to suspect a generational curse, perhaps linked to an ancestor who was improperly buried, or a forgotten unmarked grave on their property. This led to desperate attempts to appease the dead, sometimes involving rituals to locate and re-enter the remains, or even to perform belated rites to bring peace to the troubled spirit. It's a tragic cycle of fear and blame, all stemming from the power attributed to the unmarked dead. Even weather phenomena could be attributed to these restless spirits. Sudden, inexplicable storms, localized droughts, or unusual fogs might be seen as manifestations of the unquiet dead's distress or anger. It was a way of projecting human emotions and anxieties onto the natural world, giving the unpredictable forces of nature a supernatural explanation rooted in unresolved grievances from beyond the grave. You might hear people say, "The ground near old Mary's grave is crying tonight." On a particularly stormy evening, for me, the fear wasn't always about outright malice. Sometimes, the legends spoke of a profound sadness, a yearning from the unmarked grave. You might hear tales of phantom music, or faint, sorrowful singing near such places, believed to be the lament of a lonely soul. These stories, while less terrifying, still served as a cautionary reminder of the importance of remembrance and the pain of being forgotten. They evoked pity, but also a lingering sense of unease. What if that sadness could spread? The absence of a marker wasn't just physical, it was social. It meant the deceased had no family or community to claim them, or that they had been ostracized. This social isolation in death reinforced the idea of spiritual isolation, making the unmarked grave a potent symbol of forgotten or outcast status. And often, these were precisely the individuals whose spirits were believed to be the most volatile. So, when you consider an unmarked grave, it's not just a blank spot on a map, it's a narrative void, filled by generations of whispered fears, cautionary tales, and deeply ingrained behaviors. It's a testament to how profoundly the dead, even the unacknowledged dead, continue to shape the lives of the living long after their bodies return to the earth. You've explored how folkloric fears manifested in the daily lives and cautionary tales surrounding unmarked graves. Now, let's pivot our perspective. We're going to move from the realm of ancient dread and into the light of evolving understanding, tracing the slow, gradual shift from superstition to science. This isn't about dispelling the mystery entirely, but about how humanity began to unravel the purely supernatural explanations for the unsettling aspects of unmarked graves and replace them with more empirical, rational, and eventually forensic understanding. Imagine the dawn of the Enlightenment, or even earlier, as nascent scientific thought began to challenge long-held beliefs. People started to question why crops failed near certain graves, or why illnesses spread. Was it truly a restless spirit? Or could there be a more tangible, earthly explanation? This wasn't an overnight revolution, but a slow, painstaking process of observation, deduction, and, crucially, a growing comfort with disinterring the dead for study rather than just fear. One of the first shifts came with a better understanding of decomposition. The gruesome, bloated appearance of a body, the seeming lack of decay, the presence of fluids around the mouth, all these phenomena, once terrifyingly attributed to vampirism or restless spirits, began to be understood as natural stages of decomposition, influenced by factors like soil type, temperature, and burial conditions. The apparent freshness of a corpse, once a sign of the undead, was now understood as a temporary state before gases built up and bodies began to putrefy. This realization chipped away at some of the most potent visual evidence for revenants. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief as these scientific explanations started to emerge, slowly replacing the terror with a more mundane, albeit still unpleasant, reality. It meant that a family discovering a seemingly undead ancestor no longer had to resort to staking or decapitation, but could explain it through natural processes. The rise of forensic science was another pivotal step. Instead of attributing sudden death or disappearance to a malevolent ghost from an unmarked grave, investigators began to look for physical evidence. The discovery of remains could now lead to questions like, how did this person die? Were they murdered? What was their age? Sex? And potential origin? The focus shifted from the supernatural influence of the dead on the living to the circumstances of their death before burial. Think about the early pioneers of forensic anthropology and pathology. They weren't just studying bones, they were studying the stories the bones told. A broken bone, an old wound, signs of malnutrition. These weren't curses, but clues to a life, and often, to a cause of death that had nothing to do with spectral vengeance. This meticulous examination of human remains provided rational explanations for many phenomena previously attributed to ghosts or curses. There's an ongoing academic debate among historians of science about the precise timeline and cultural impact of the shift from supernatural to scientific explanations for unexplained phenomena related to death and unmarked graves. It wasn't a linear progression, and often, scientific understanding coexisted with, rather than immediately replaced. Older folk beliefs, the development of archaeology also played a huge role. Instead of stumbling upon unmarked graves in terror, archaeologists began systematically excavating them. They meticulously documented the context of the burials, the orientation of the bodies, any artifacts found, and the geological conditions. This allowed for a broader understanding of ancient burial practices, disease patterns, and even social hierarchies. Stripping away the mystery and replacing it with historical data, an unmarked grave, once a source of dread, became a valuable research site. Consider how this shift impacted the fear of grave sickness. As germ theory emerged and public health practices improved, the spread of disease became understood through bacteria and viruses, not through spectral emanations from the ground. While disturbing a grave could indeed unearth pathogens, it was a biological risk, not a supernatural curse. This scientific understanding allowed people to implement practical solutions, like better sanitation and regulated burial practices, instead of resorting to superstitious rituals. This transition wasn't always smooth. Superstition is deeply ingrained, and scientific discovery often faces resistance. You might find instances where a new, rational explanation was offered, but local communities still clung to older beliefs, perhaps seeing the science as merely describing how the curse worked, rather than negating its existence entirely. It's a testament to the persistent power of folklore and tradition. One fascinating detail of this shift is how early scientists sometimes inadvertently reinforced old fears. For example, early anatomical studies, often involving the disinterment of bodies, were sometimes conducted in secret due to public outcry, which in turn fueled rumors and anxieties about disturbing the dead. It was a complex dance between scientific progress and lingering societal taboos. However, the ultimate result was a profound change in perspective. An unmarked grave, while still a poignant symbol of forgotten lives, ceased to be a direct source of supernatural dread for most rational minds. The emphasis shifted from fearing the actions of the dead to understanding the circumstances of their lives and deaths. It became a historical puzzle to solve, rather than a supernatural threat to avoid. So, as you step out of the shadows of ancient dread and into the clearer, albeit sometimes still unsettling, light of scientific inquiry, you realize that the story of unmarked graves is not just one of fear, but of humanity's slow, persistent journey towards understanding. The whispers in the dirt, once attributed to restless spirits, slowly began to tell different stories, tales of disease, poverty, violence, and the quiet march of decomposition, all waiting to be deciphered by the tools of science. You've witnessed the slow, empowering shift from superstitious dread to scientific inquiry regarding unmarked graves. But here's the fascinating thing, even in our seemingly rational modern world, the ancient fears rarely disappear entirely. Instead, They often echo in contemporary culture and horror narratives, subtly shaping our entertainment and tapping into those very primal anxieties we thought we'd outgrown. Imagine sitting in a darkened movie theater, or curled up on your couch watching a horror film. How often does the plot involve a haunted house built on an ancient, unhallowed burial ground, or a terrible curse unleashed because someone disturbed a forgotten grave? This isn't just coincidence, it's a direct descendant of the very superstitions we've been discussing. The idea of the restless spirit from an unmarked grave, denied peace and seeking vengeance or simply resolution, remains a potent narrative device. It's a trope because it taps into something deeply unsettling within us. Think about the archetypal Indian burial ground narrative in countless horror films. Even if it's often a poorly researched or culturally insensitive trope, the core fear isn't just about disturbing sacred land. It's about disturbing unmarked sacred land, where the spirits are believed to be more active, more volatile, and more prone to retaliation. The lack of a visible marker immediately signals danger, a void waiting to be filled with dread. You inherently know, as a viewer, that something bad is going to happen if the characters build a shopping mall or a housing development over such a place. Modern horror often plays on the fear of unidentified remains. The discovery of a skeleton without context, without a name, without a story, is inherently unsettling. Forensic shows might solve the mystery, but horror films twist it, suggesting that the spirit of the unidentified person cannot rest until their identity is known, or their injustice is rectified. This directly mirrors the ancient belief that a name was crucial for the soul's journey. The modern fear is of unresolved suffering, projecting itself onto the living. Consider the popularity of ghost hunting shows or urban exploration. Why are abandoned cemeteries, particularly those with neglected, unmarked sections, so appealing? It's not just the decay or the history, it's the lingering suggestion that perhaps some of those ancient beliefs might have a kernel of truth, that the emotional energy of the unquiet dead might still resonate there. You'll hear participants whisper about cold spots, unexplained noises, or feelings of sadness, all echoes of the very same phenomena once attributed to angry spirits by our ancestors. The modern concept of a poltergeist, a noisy ghost that physically affects its environment, often feels like an amplified version of the old belief in a restless spirit from an unmarked grave, causing misfortune or disrupting the living space. While the causes are different, often linked to adolescent energy and folklore, the manifestation of an unseen entity causing chaos draws directly from the fear of the unquiet dead impacting the physical world. There's an interesting academic discussion among cultural theorists about whether modern horror narratives primarily reflect societal anxieties about death and identity, or if they actively perpetuate pre-scientific superstitions in new forms. It's likely both. Horror taps into existing fears but also reshapes them for contemporary consumption. A slightly humorous, but revealing aspect is how readily we accept these tropes without necessarily believing in them literally. We know, intellectually, that a vampire isn't going to rise from a disturbed grave, yet when we see it in a story, we suspend our disbelief because the narrative taps into a very old, very deep part of our collective consciousness. It feels right for a ghost to be angry if its grave is unmarked. It feels right for bad luck to follow someone who disrespects the dead, even in popular culture beyond explicit horror. The idea of an unmarked grave carries weight. It implies a tragic end, a forgotten life. A story untold, a song about an unknown soldier or a pauper's grave, evokes a profound sense of sadness and a desire for remembrance, hinting at the lingering human need for dignity in death. Regardless of actual supernatural belief, the concept resonates because the historical fear of anonymity in death is still very much with us, albeit in a secularized form. The modern fascination with true crime and missing persons cases also touches on these ancient anxieties. The ultimate goal in many of these investigations is to identify the victim, to give them a name, and to allow their family closure. This is a secular echo of the ancient need to name the dead, to mark their place, and to ensure their peaceful repose. Even if the peace is now psychological for the living rather than spiritual for the deceased, the fear of being buried without identity, a nightmare scenario, is a powerful motivator for forensic teams today. So, as you consider the countless horror films and ghost stories you've encountered, you can see the clear lineage tracing back to the quiet dread of an ancient, anonymous patch of earth. The terrible superstitions surrounding unmarked graves might have lost their literal grip on most of us, but their echoes are everywhere, whispering through our entertainment and reminding us that some fears, especially those about death and the unknown, are truly eternal. You've explored how the ancient dread of unmarked graves persists in modern storytelling. Now, let's shift from the realm of fear and folklore to a more compassionate, contemporary effort, the dignity of remembrance. This is about the profound human need to identify and honor those whose graves have remained forgotten. A silent testament to our evolving understanding of what it means to truly lay the dead to rest. Imagine the work of a modern forensic anthropologist or a dedicated historical society volunteer. Their goal isn't to ward off restless spirits, but to right historical wrongs, to bring closure to families, and to ensure that no one remains truly forgotten. This is a far cry from the superstitious terror of the past. It's a testament to a deeply ingrained sense of human empathy and justice. Consider the ongoing efforts to identify the remains of soldiers from past conflicts, from world wars to the Vietnam War, and even older conflicts like the American Civil War. Thousands of service members remain listed as unknown. Dedicated teams meticulously excavate battlefields, analyze skeletal remains using cutting-edge DNA technology, and cross-reference with historical records and family trees. The discovery of a dog tag, a button, a dental record, each small clue is a piece of a puzzle, painstakingly put together to give a nameless soldier back their identity. When a soldier, buried for decades in an unmarked grave, is finally identified and returned to their family for a proper burial, it's not just a scientific achievement, it's a profound act of remembrance. You can almost feel the weight of history lifted when a name is finally put to a long-forgotten set of remains. It transforms an anonymous casualty into a son, a brother, a father, a real person with a story that can finally be told. This isn't about appeasing a ghost, but about healing the wounds of history for the living, providing a sense of peace that spans generations, beyond military contexts. Similar efforts are underway for historical unmarked graves. Think about forgotten paupers' cemeteries, or the burial grounds of marginalized communities in some cases. Historical societies or indigenous groups are working to locate, document, and properly mark graves that were neglected or deliberately hidden due to social prejudice or lack of resources. This might involve extensive archival research, ground-penetrating radar to locate unmarked plots, and then the careful process of erecting a simple monument or a plaque that acknowledges those who lie beneath. Forensic anthropologists and historians often highlight the ethical considerations and complexities involved in disturbing historical, unmarked graves, balancing the desire for identification and remembrance with the need to respect human remains and the wishes of any surviving cultural groups. This emphasizes that modern efforts are highly nuanced and respectful. A powerful example often arises in the context of residential schools or mass graves from humanitarian crises. The discovery of unmarked burials in these sites is a tragic and painful reminder of past injustices. The subsequent efforts to identify the victims, to understand the circumstances of their deaths, and to provide them with dignified, often culturally appropriate, burials is a critical step towards reconciliation and healing. It's about giving a voice to those who were silenced, ensuring their stories are never again buried without a trace. This process of identification and remarking isn't just about the deceased, it's profoundly about the living. It offers closure to grieving families who may have wondered for decades what happened to their loved ones. It provides a tangible connection to their ancestry. It allows communities to acknowledge past wrongs and to publicly mourn those who were once deliberately forgotten. The act of placing a name on an unmarked grave transforms it from a symbol of neglect into a beacon of remembrance. You might see small, simple ceremonies held at newly marked graves, a quiet gathering, a few words spoken, perhaps a flower laid. These acts, though seemingly small, carry immense weight. They are a rejection of the old superstitions that condemn the unmarked dead to eternal restlessness instead. They embrace a modern understanding that every life has value, and every death deserves acknowledgement. It's a fundamental human right to be remembered. Even if that remembrance comes centuries too late, one unique, albeit challenging. Detail in this work is the ethical dilemma of mass graves, where individual identification is impossible. In such cases, the dignity of remembrance might take the form of a communal monument, a single marker acknowledging those who lie here unknown, or to the unnamed victims. This still fulfills the human need to mark the space, to acknowledge the loss, and to honor the lives that ended there. Even if individual names cannot be recovered, as you reflect on these modern efforts, you realize that the story of unmarked graves continues to evolve, from ancient fears of restless spirits to a contemporary drive for justice and remembrance. Our relationship with the unacknowledged dead has changed profoundly. The goal is no longer to ward off a curse, but to bestow dignity, to restore identity, and to ensure that no human life, however humble or tragic its end, is ever truly erased from the tapestry of history. You've journeyed through the unsettling superstitions, the bizarre preventions, and the modern dignifying efforts surrounding unmarked graves. As our time in this quiet, reflective space draws to a close, let's settle into the whispers in the dirt, contemplating the enduring, universal human need to acknowledge the dead, whether their resting places are marked or unmarked, and the profound significance that act of remembrance holds for us all. Imagine, one last time, that desolate patch of earth, that quiet mound with no name. What is it that truly calls to us from such a place? Is it the residual fear of ancient curses? Or something deeper? Something intrinsically human? Perhaps it's the understanding that every such mound, however anonymous, represents a life lived, a story untold, a future unfulfilled. And within us lies an innate desire for that story to be acknowledged, for that life to be recognized. The human need to mark death is almost as old as humanity itself. From the earliest burial mounds of our ancestors to the elaborate mausoleums of emperors, we have always sought to delineate the boundary between the living and the dead. To say, someone was here, they mattered. A grave marker, however simple, is a declaration against oblivion, a small act of defiance against the relentless march of time. When that marker is absent, the void feels profound. The very concept of an unmarked grave challenges our innate desire for order and meaning. It's a disruption to the narrative. Who was this person? What were their hopes, their fears, their joys, their sorrows without a name, without a date? These questions hang unanswered, creating a sense of unresolved longing not just for the deceased, but for those of us who ponder their unknown fate. Consider the universal discomfort we feel when confronted with anonymity in death. Whether it's the unidentified victim of a tragedy or the forgotten soldier in a forgotten field. Our instinct is to seek identification, to restore their individuality. This is not about literal haunting. It's about a deep human drive for every life to have a place. Both in memory and physically, in death, archaeological studies consistently show that even in pre-literate societies, There were often clear, if simple, ways of indicating burial locations or distinguishing individual graves within larger cemeteries, suggesting the impulse to mark is very ancient. The whispers in the dirt aren't literal sounds from restless spirits. They are the echoes of our own anxieties about being forgotten. They are the quiet questions about legacy, about remembrance, about how we will be honored when our own time comes. An unmarked grave holds up a mirror to these very human fears, reminding us of the fragility of memory and the importance of those who come after us. In a way, the old superstitions, for all their terror, served a purpose. They powerfully, if fearfully, reinforced the societal importance of proper burial rites and public acknowledgement of the dead. They were extreme, supernatural cautionary tales about the profound consequences of neglecting those who had passed on. Even today, the unsettling feeling of an unmarked grave harks back to that ancient wisdom that death, if not acknowledged, can leave a lingering unease. But now, our understanding has evolved. The act of identifying and marking forgotten graves is not about appeasing angry ghosts, but about a more enlightened form of respect. It's about providing dignity to those who were denied it in life or in death. It's about historical accuracy, social justice, and the quiet healing that comes from finally saying, "We remember you. You are not forgotten." You might find yourself, even casually, wondering about the unnamed people buried in the forgotten corners of the world, the victims of ancient plagues, the anonymous poor, the marginalized who simply slipped through the cracks of history. And in that moment of quiet contemplation, you are, in a small way, acknowledging them. You are giving them a brief moment of your thought, a whisper of remembrance. So, as the journey concludes, let your mind drift gently away from the eerie pathways of fear and settle into the serene landscape of remembrance. The Roman catacombs we explored before, with their ancient names and symbols, stand as a grand counterpoint to the humble, unmarked grave, yet both speak to the same universal human needs, whether etched in stone or whispered through generations. The desire to honor the dead, to give them a place, to let their stories resonate, is one of the most enduring and profoundly human impulses. Let the final images of unmarked graves, those silent, humble places, fade softly from your mind. There's a gentle coolness in the air now, and the quiet hum of the fan is a comforting lullaby. The stories, both terrible and tender, of those who sleep beneath the soil have been told. Allow your thoughts to settle, calm and peaceful, as you drift into a deep and restful sleep.